The air in the forward operating base tasted of diesel, rot, and tension. It clung to the back of Lieutenant Commander Maya Callahan's throat, a constant, gritty reminder of where she was. FOB Nightingale, a muddy patch of trampled earth carved out of a jungle that seemed intent on swallowing it whole. She stood by the rain-streaked window of the temporary administrative office, watching the men move across the compound. They were mostly Army Rangers from the 75th, a few Delta operators with beards and inscrutable eyes. They moved with the lazy, coiled spring energy of predators, but their eyes, when they flicked toward her, were anything but lazy. They were sharp, assessing, and universally dismissive. Callahan was Navy. More than that, she was a SEAL. The gold trident pinned to her uniform was a declaration, but here, in this sea of multicam and Army doctrine, it felt more like a target. She was the first female operator to be integrated into this particular Joint Special Operations Task Force, an experiment some high-level Pentagon official had deemed necessary. The men on the ground clearly considered it an unwelcome one. She could feel their judgment in the way they fell silent when she entered the mess hall, the way their conversations resumed a half-octave lower as she passed. They didn't see a fellow operator. They saw a headline, a political statement, a compromise to their brutally exclusive world. She had seen it before, but never with this level of unified systemic hostility. This base was General Marcus Thorne's kingdom, and the king did not approve. Her gear was stowed, her bunk assigned in a sterile private container, a courtesy that was more an act of isolation than respect. She had spent the first 2 hours on base field stripping her SIG Sauer P226 and her custom 17 Malawian Quatches rifle, her hands moving with an economy of motion that was as ingrained as breathing. The familiar scent of gun oil and the cold, precise click of metal on metal were a comfort, a small island of order in a sea of unspoken contempt. A young ranger, barely out of his teens, had delivered her initial briefing packet. He'd averted his eyes the entire time, mumbling his words and practically fleeing the room once his duty was done. He'd left behind a faint trail of nervous energy and the acrid smell of chewing tobacco. Now, as the bruised purple of dusk began to bleed into the sky, a runner appeared at her door. "General Thorne wants to see you, ma'am. Command tent. 1900 hours." Callahan glanced at her watch. 1850. 10 minutes. "Thank you," she said, her voice even. The runner, a corporal with a sunburnt neck, nodded curtly and vanished back into the humid twilight. She secured her sidearm, settled her cover on her head, and stepped out into the mud. The air was thick enough to drink, promising another night of torrential rain. The path to the command tent was a raised boardwalk of slick, splintered pallets. Underneath, the mud churned with the consistency of pudding. Men moved past her, their boots thudding on the wood, none of them meeting her eye. It was a deliberate, practiced ignorance. Inside the command tent, the air was a fog of sweat, coffee, and electronics. A dozen officers and senior NCOs were gathered around a large holographic map table, displaying a topographic rendering of the surrounding mountains. In the center of it all stood General Thorne. He was a man carved from granite and impatience. His jaw was perpetually clenched, and his eyes, a pale, unforgiving blue, swept over the room with an air of absolute ownership. He was Army through and through, from his perfectly starched uniform to his belief in overwhelming force and rigid hierarchy. As Callahan entered, the low murmur of conversation ceased. Thorne's gaze landed on her, and the temperature in the tent seemed to drop 10 degrees. He let the silence stretch, forcing every eye in the room onto her. "Lieutenant Commander Callahan," he finally said, his voice a low growl that cut through the hum of the generators. "Welcome to Nightingale." It was not a welcome. It was an indictment. She walked forward, stopping a respectful distance from the table. "General," her acknowledgement was crisp, professional, devoid of any emotion he could seize upon. He gestured vaguely at the holographic map. "We are tasked with locating and neutralizing a regional arms dealer. Codename, the Serpent. He's financed insurgencies across 3 continents. We've tracked him to a compound deep in the Cordillera Negra." a place the locals call El Nido del Diablo, the Devil's Nest. He looked around the room at his men. The 75th will form the primary assault element. Delta will provide overwatch and handle the HVT extraction. Standard operating procedure. His eyes snapped back to Callahan. The Navy has seen fit to grace us with your presence. They tell me you're qualified for this sort of work. The condescension was a physical force, pressing in on her. Beside Thorne, a ranger captain named Miller, all sharp chin and arrogant smirk, folded his arms. He was the picture of smug confidence. Master Sergeant Reyes, a man with a face like a worn leather map and decades of hard miles in his eyes, stood impassively, his expression unreadable. "I am General," Callahan replied. Thorne took a slow step toward her, his boots heavy on the plywood floor. He stopped directly in front of her, forcing her to tilt her head back slightly to meet his gaze. He was invading her space, a classic power move. "Here at this command," he began, his voice dropping so everyone had to strain to hear, "we don't care about politics. We don't care about press releases from the Pentagon. We care about one thing: mission success. That success is built on trust. Trust in the operator to your left and your right." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "That trust is not given. It is not a right conferred by a piece of paper or a diversity initiative. It is earned. It is earned in blood, in sweat, and in the dirt of 100 miserable hellholes just like this 1 inch. His eyes dropped from her face to the gleaming gold trident pinned above her left breast pocket. The symbol she had bled for had pushed her body and mind past every conceivable limit to earn. "I've read your file, Commander. Top of your class at Annapolis. Stellar performance in BUD/S. On paper, you're a ghost, a prodigy." He leaned in closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "But paper burns. And I have never seen a SEAL, man or woman, who wasn't full of enough arrogance to sink a carrier. Here you are not special. You are a variable, an unknown quantity in a life-or-death equation." He straightened up, his voice rising back to its command tone. "And I do not tolerate unknown variables on my battlefield." The room was utterly still. The only sound was the drumming of the first heavy raindrops on the tent canvas. "So we're going to start from a clean slate," Thorne declared. He pointed a single, thick finger at her chest. "Take it off." A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed through the room. Captain Miller's smirk widened. Reyes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. To ask an operator to remove their qualification insignia was the ultimate insult, a public stripping of identity and honor. It was an act of profound humiliation. Callahan's face remained a mask of placid control. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure, cold rage, but her hands were steady. Her gaze never left Thorne's. She did not protest. She did not argue. She simply acted. Her fingers went to the 2 clutches on the back of the pin. With precise, deliberate movements, she unfastened them. The fabric of her uniform rustled. She pulled the trident free. It felt unnaturally heavy in her palm, its familiar weight a sudden, profound loss. She held it out to him, her hand flat, her arm locked. The gold gleamed under the harsh tactical lighting. Thorne stared at it for a long moment, then at her. He was expecting a reaction, a flicker of anger, a tremor of protest, a tear of frustration. He got nothing. He got a calm, gray-eyed stare that seemed to look straight through him. Her composure unnerved him more than any outburst would have. With a grunt, he snatched the trident from her palm, his thick fingers closing around it. "You will be attached to Captain Miller's assault element," Thorne growled, turning his back on her as if she were dismissed from existence. "You will carry a rifle and you will follow orders. If you survive this operation, and if you prove you can be more than a liability, you might get this back." He pocketed the pin without another glance. "If not, the jungle can have you. Dismissed." Callahan snapped a perfect salute to the general's back. She held it for a beat, then dropped her arm, pivoted on her heel, and walked out of the tent. She didn't look at Miller's triumphant grin or Reyes's troubled frown. She walked with her back straight, her head held high, into the burgeoning storm. The space on her uniform where her trident had been felt like a raw, open wound. As she stepped off the boardwalk, the cold, driving rain began to fall in earnest, washing over her, but it couldn't touch the ice that had formed in her soul. The mission briefing was a study in Thorne's rigid tactical philosophy. It was loud, fast, and arrogant. The plan was a hammer blow, a frontal assault designed to overwhelm through speed and firepower. 2 MH-60 Black Hawks would insert Miller's Ranger platoon on a ridge overlooking the compound, while a Delta team in a Little Bird would fast-rope directly onto the HVT's building. Simple, brutal, textbook. Callahan, standing at the back of the ready room, saw the flaws immediately. The holographic map showed a deep ravine flanking the compound to the east. The monsoon was early this year, the rains heavier than forecasted. That ravine was a funnel. During the Q&A, she raised a hand. Miller, who was leading the briefing, pointedly ignored her. She kept her hand raised, motionless. Finally, Master Sergeant Reyes cleared his throat. Captain, Lieutenant Commander Callahan has a question. Miller's jaw tightened. Fine. What is it, Commander? The title was a sneer. The Eastern Ravine, Callahan said, her voice calm and level. The forecast calls for another 3 inches of rain before dawn. That ravine will become a flash flood zone. It cuts off our primary exfiltration route and provides the enemy a covered channel to flank our assault position. Miller scoffed. We'll be in and out in 20 minutes. The rain is a non-issue. It provides noise and visual cover. It's an asset. It's a liability if we get bogged down, she countered. There's a secondary LZ-3 clicks to the north, on higher ground. A longer infiltration, but it keeps us out of the floodplain and provides a secure fallback position. Thorne, observing from a raised platform, cut in. Your concern is noted, Commander, and dismissed. We are not altering the plan for a little bit of weather. We stick to the primary. You will be in Chalk 2 with Sergeant Reyes. Is that clear? Crystal, General, Callahan replied, her expression unreadable. The flight in was rough. The Black Hawks bucked and yawed through curtains of torrential rain. Inside the troop bay, the Rangers were a knot of quiet tension, their faces painted, their gear checked and rechecked. Callahan sat opposite Reyes, her borrowed M4 held loosely in her lap. She felt like an outsider, a ghost in their machine. The empty spot on her chest seemed to throb with every lurch of the helicopter. Green light! Green light! Go! The rope dropped into the churning darkness. One by one, the Rangers slid down into the whipping trees and soaking mud of the ridge. Callahan followed Reyes, her descent smooth and controlled. Her boots hit the ground, sinking 6 inches into the muck. The noise was immense, the roar of the rotors, the hammering of the rain, the wind screaming through the trees. Then the helicopters were gone, and the jungle soundscape crashed in on them. They were alone. Miller got them moving. 2-minute interval. Let's go. Let's go. Keep it tight. They moved down the ridge, the mud sucking at their boots. The compound was a cluster of dim, sodium lights visible through the dense foliage below. The rain was relentless, turning the ground into a treacherous slurry. They were 200 meters from their final assault position when the world exploded. It wasn't an IED. It was a coordinated ambush. Green tracers stitched the darkness from 3 sides. RPGs screamed past, impacting the trees above them with deafening cracks, showering them with splinters and hot shrapnel. The lead fire team went down in a tangled heap of screams and groans. Contact front. Contact left. Contact right. Reyes roared, laying down a burst of suppressive fire from his saw. It was a perfectly executed trap. The enemy had used the storm's noise to mask their approach and had anticipated their exact route. Miller, caught in the open, screamed into his radio. Talon 1, this is Ranger Lead. We are in a TIC. Repeat, troops in contact. Danger close. The radio hissed back static. Nothing. From above, Callahan heard the distinctive hump of mortar fire. A second later, A shell landed 20 meters behind them, blasting mud and vegetation into the air. They were bracketed. "They've got us boxed in," a ranger yelled. "We gotta pull back." "Negative," Miller shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Push through. Push through to the objective." It was suicide. They were outnumbered and outpositioned. Callahan saw it instantly, but they were Army Rangers trained to follow the officer's orders, and Miller had lost control. Then she heard a new sound, a deep, rumbling groan that was not thunder. It was the sound of earth and water moving. She looked toward the eastern ravine. A wall of brown water, churning with uprooted trees and debris, was roaring down the gully, exactly as she had predicted. Their exfil route was gone. Not just gone, it was now a death trap. An RPG slammed into a tree near General Thorne, who had inexplicably come along, ostensibly to observe the tree splintered, and a heavy branch crashed down, catching him across the legs. He cried out, a sharp, choked sound of pain. The command element was in disarray. Miller was frozen, screaming uselessly into a dead radio. Thorne was down. The platoon was taking casualties, their fire becoming sporadic and panicked. They were about to be overrun. This was it. The moment the system broke. Callahan moved. There was no thought, only action. The years of training, the hundreds of brutal, unforgiving scenarios, took over. The world slowed down, the chaos resolving into a series of clear, simple problems. First, leadership. She crawled through the mud and grabbing vines to where Captain Miller was crouched behind a log, his eyes wide with terror. "Captain!" she yelled over the din of gunfire. He didn't respond. She grabbed the front of his plate carrier and shook him hard. "Miller, get your men to pull back to that rock formation. Now!" She pointed to a defensible cluster of boulders 50 meters up the slope. Miller just stared at her, his mouth agape. No time. She keyed her own comm unit, switching to the platoon's internal frequency. "All Ranger elements, this is Callahan. Pull back to the rock outcropping at grid 0-4-7, Niner 1-1-2. Bounding Overwatch. Reyes, you have the base of fire. Go!" There was a half-second of hesitation. An order from the woman they'd all scorned. Then Reyes's voice crackled back, solid and sure. "Roger that. First squad, on me. Second squad, cover our move." The platoon, given a clear, concise order, responded instantly. The discipline training kicked in. They began a professional, fighting withdrawal, laying down disciplined bursts of fire as they moved from cover to cover. Second, casualties. Callahan slung her rifle and low-crawled to Thorne. The general was propped against the base of the shattered tree, his face pale, his teeth gritted in pain. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle below the knee. A compound fracture. "General, I need to look at your leg," she said, her voice calm. Thorne, his authority shattered along with his tibia, just nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She pulled a pair of trauma shears from her IFAK and cut away his pant leg. The sight was ugly. Bone jutted through the skin, and the area was already swelling. He was going into shock. She worked quickly, her hands sure and steady despite the chaos. She applied a tourniquet high on his thigh, cinching it tight to stanch the bleeding. From her pack, she produced a SAM splint, molding it around his fractured leg. She didn't have morphine, but she had a small vial of ketamine for battlefield analgesia. "General, this will help with the pain, but it's going to make you feel strange," she said, preparing the injector. "Just try to relax." She administered the dose into his thigh muscle. He grunted, his body tensing, then slowly relaxing as the powerful dissociative anesthetic took hold. Reyes and the last of his men reached the rock formation, dragging 2 other wounded Rangers with them. "All accounted for, Commander," he yelled. "Ammo is black on saw, red on rifles." They were critically low. The enemy, emboldened, was beginning to advance, using the trees as cover. "Set up a 360-degree defense," Callahan ordered, dragging Thorne the last few feet into the relative safety of the rocks. Consolidate ammo with the best marksmen. Strip the non-essential gear from the wounded. We travel light. Single file count off when I give the word. Captain Miller had finally snapped out of his stupor. He stumbled into the perimeter, his face ashen. He looked at Callahan, then at the organized defense she had conjured from chaos, then at the general being treated with expert care. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Captain," Callahan said, her voice sharp but not unkind. "Get a head count and an ammo status. Report back to me in 2 minutes." Giving him a simple, direct task was the quickest way to bring him back online. He nodded numbly and scrambled off to obey. The enemy was probing their defenses, their fire more confident now. The Rangers, their fear replaced by the grim determination of a cornered animal, returned fire with disciplined single shots. They were conserving every round. Callahan surveyed their position. It was defensible for now, but they couldn't stay. The enemy knew exactly where they were, and it was only a matter of time before they brought up heavier weapons or simply waited for them to run out of bullets. Their radios were dead, their exfil route a raging river, and their commander was incapacitated. They were cut off and alone. She pulled out her own map, a waterproof topographical one she always carried, and a lensatic compass. The rain plastered her hair to her face as she shielded the map with her body, studying it under the dim red light of her headlamp. Miller's non-issue rain had become the defining feature of the battlespace. It was their enemy, but it could also be their savior. "Listen up," she called, her voice cutting through the storm. The remaining dozen Rangers, Miller, and Reyes gathered close. "The enemy expects us to stay here and die, or try to fight our way back up the ridge. We're going to do neither." She pointed to the map. "This ridge we're on is part of a larger system. 2 clicks to the northwest, there's a saddle, a low point between 2 peaks. It's a sheer climb, but it leads to the far side of the mountain range. The enemy won't expect us to go that way. It's too difficult, especially in this weather." "Climb," Miller sputtered. "With 3 wounded, including the general? In this mud? It's impossible." "It's not impossible," Callahan stated, her voice flat and absolute. "It's just hard. The alternative is staying here and waiting for them to finish us off. We move in 10 minutes. We'll fashion litters for the wounded. We'll move slow, but we'll move quiet. The storm is our cover." She looked from face to face, her gray eyes seeming to pierce the gloom. There was no fear in them, only an unyielding resolve. "We live or die on this climb. Your choice." No one argued. The sheer, unshakable certainty in her voice left no room for dissent. They had seen their own command structure collapse, their textbook plan fail catastrophically. Now, this quiet, humiliated woman was offering them the only thing they had left: a chance. Reyes was the first to move. "You heard her. Let's get it done." He started stripping ponchos and gathering branches to improvise stretchers. The other Rangers followed his lead, their movements now infused with a desperate purpose. Callahan moved to a wounded Ranger, a young PFC with a nasty shrapnel wound in his shoulder. She quickly cleaned and packed the wound, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a surgeon. She wrapped it tightly, her expression focused, her touch surprisingly gentle. As she worked, she plotted their route in her head, memorizing the terrain, calculating the energy expenditure, the risks. The jungle wasn't just an obstacle. It was a system of systems. The rain, the mud, the vegetation, the enemy. They were all variables in a complex equation she was now solving in real time. She wasn't just leading them out of an ambush. She was waging a private war against chaos itself. And for the first time since landing, Callahan felt the familiar, cold clarity of purpose settle over her. She was in her element. The Devil's Nest was about to find out what happened when it cornered one of the night's own children. The climb was a vision of hell. The slope was a near-vertical wall of mud, slick rock, and tangled roots. Every foot of progress was a battle. The improvised litters, carrying the dead weight of the wounded men, were brutally difficult to manage. The men carrying them slipped and fell constantly, their muscles screaming in protest, their lungs burning in the thin, wet air. Callahan was everywhere at once. She took the lead, her boots finding purchase where others could not. She used her e-tool to carve handholds into the mud wall. She scouted short, 10-meter sections, then returned to guide the main body forward. She took her turn on the litters, her lean frame belying a strength that shocked the hardened rangers. She never raised her voice, never showed frustration. Her commands were quiet, precise. Shift your weight left, use that route for leverage, 3-minute water stop. Now, hours bled into one another. The rain never stopped. They were all soaked to the bone, their bodies shivering with cold and exhaustion. The enemy was still behind them, but the treacherous terrain was a more immediate threat. Several times, a man would slip, only to be caught by the person behind him. They moved with the agonizing slowness of snails, a single, miserable organism fighting its way up the side of the world. During one brief halt, huddled under a rocky overhang that offered minimal shelter, Master Sergeant Reyes watched her. She was checking the lashings on General Thorne's splint, her movements efficient and sure in the dim light. He noticed the way she tied off the strap, a modified clove hitch with a quick-release loop. It was an obscure knot, favored by climbers and combat divers for its security and ease of release under tension. He'd seen it only once before. It was years ago in the Pesh Valley of Afghanistan. A long-range reconnaissance team had been compromised, their position overrun. All but one. A single operator, separated from the team, had held off a company of insurgents for 36 hours from a collapsed sheepherder's hut. Wounded, with a failing radio, the operator had methodically called in danger-close airstrikes, walking artillery onto their own position to break the final assault. The operator used the terrain, the shadows, and a terrifying patience to dismantle the enemy force piece by piece. The legend of that engagement was whispered in hushed tones in SOCOM circles. The lone survivor's call sign was Nix, a ghost. No one knew who Nix was, what unit they belonged to, or even if they were male or female. They were simply a myth, the embodiment of single-operator lethality. The after-action report, heavily redacted, had mentioned the operator used a specific knot to secure a field-expedient antenna. Reyes's blood ran cold. He crawled over to where Callahan was now cleaning the mud from her rifle's action, her movements rhythmic and focused. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low. She looked up, her gray eyes unreadable in the gloom. "Task Force 117. Operation Anvil's Edge," Reyes said, barely a whisper. "The Pesh Valley." Callahan's hands stilled for a fraction of a second. She didn't speak. She didn't nod. She simply met his gaze, and in the depths of her eyes, Reyes saw it. He saw the cold, lonely peaks of the Hindu Kush. He saw the muzzle flashes in the darkness. He saw the calm center of a hurricane of violence. He saw Nix. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just a competent officer who had taken charge. This was a living legend. The woman Thorne had humiliated, the officer they had all dismissed as a political pawn, was the ghost who haunted the nightmares of America's enemies. He simply nodded, a slow, profound gesture of understanding and awe. He backed away, his mind reeling. He looked at Captain Miller, who was staring blankly at his own muddy hands, then at the exhausted rangers. They had no idea. Reyes went to the nearest man, a young sergeant named Diaz. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "That woman, you do whatever she says. You hear me? Exactly as she says it. No hesitation." Diaz looked at him, confused. "Sergeant." "She's the one," Reyes said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's Nix." The name, the call sign, meant nothing to the young ranger. But the look on the master sergeant's face, a look of pure, unadulterated reverence, was enough. The word spread through the exhausted platoon in hushed, disbelieving whispers. They didn't know the story, not the details, but they knew it was something immense. The way they looked at Callahan began to change. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a dawning, fearful respect. They weren't just following an officer anymore. They were following a specter. They reached the saddle just before dawn. The rain had finally slackened to a miserable drizzle. Below them, on the far side of the mountain, lay a vast, unbroken carpet of jungle canopy. They were through the worst of the terrain, but they were far from safe. They were deep in hostile territory, with no communication and dwindling supplies. Callahan found a concealed position in a dense thicket of bamboo and called a halt. The men collapsed, their bodies spent. She posted 2 sentries, then immediately set about tending to the wounded again. She checked Thorne's leg, redressing the wound. The general was conscious now, the ketamine having worn off, leaving him in a state of lucid agony. He watched her work, his face a mask of pain and conflicted emotions. "My radio," he rasped. "The sat phone in my pack." Callahan had already salvaged it. The casing was cracked and it was soaked. "It's dead, General. The impact and the water killed it." She saw a flicker of despair in his eyes. He had failed. His hubris had led these men into a death trap, and now all his rank, all his authority, was meaningless. He was just another piece of broken cargo. But Callahan wasn't giving up. She began to carefully disassemble the sat phone, laying the components out on a dry poncho. Her fingers, deft and sure, worked at the delicate circuitry with a jeweler's precision. Miller watched her, mystified. "What are you doing?" "The main board is fried," she said without looking up. "But the iridium transmitter module might be intact. And the battery, if I can dry it out, might have one last charge in it." For the next hour, she worked. She used a small bit of C4 from a breaching charge, not as an explosive, but as a heat source, burning tiny, controlled pieces to gently dry the battery and circuit board. It was an incredibly dangerous, delicate process. One mistake and the entire thing would go up in a flash. The Rangers watched in silent awe. They were trained to use C4 to blow things up. She was using it to perform microsurgery. She cannibalized a wire from a headlamp and the antenna from a broken PRC-152 radio. She bypassed the phone's fried processor, soldering the wires directly to the transmitter module using a heated combat knife and a sliver of resin she scraped from a pine tree. It was a Frankenstein's monster of electronics, a desperate, impossible gamble. Finally, she was done. She held up the jury-rigged device. A battery, a transmitter, and 2 wires. "We'll get one shot," she said. "One short data burst. Not enough for a voice call. Just a set of coordinates." She climbed to the highest point of their position, holding the makeshift antenna up to the sky, trying to acquire a satellite link. The rest of the team waited in breathless silence. The small LED on the module flickered green. Link acquired. With her other hand, she tapped out a sequence on the 2 wires, using them like a telegraph key to send a bare-bones data packet in Morse code. Their grid coordinates and the number of wounded. The light flickered as the data transmitted, then died. The battery was spent. She slid back down into their hideout. "It's sent," she said. "Now we see if anyone was listening." They didn't have to wait long. An hour later, they heard it. The faint, distant thump-thump-thump of helicopter rotors. It grew steadily louder, but from the wrong direction. Not from the direction of FOB Nightingale, but from the north. And it wasn't the sound of a Black Hawk. It was the heavier, deeper beat of a SH-47 Chinook. Then they heard another sound. The angry buzz of enemy machine gun fire from the valley below. The enemy had heard it too, and they were racing to the position. "They're coming," a sentry hissed. "Fast!" Tracers began to cut through the trees below them. The rescue chopper was on its way, but the enemy was going to get to them first. They were on a small, exposed hilltop with almost no ammunition. This was the end of the line. "This is it," Miller said, his voice grim as he chambered his last magazine. "We make our stand here." "No," Callahan said, her eyes scanning the terrain. "We don't. We give them a different problem." She pointed to a narrow game trail that led away from the approaching helicopter, deeper into the jungle. "The enemy thinks we want to be rescued. They'll rush this position to stop us. We're not going to be here." Then she looked at a precarious overhang of loose rock and shale directly above the path the enemy would have to take. "Reyes, Give me your remaining C4. All of it. Reyes handed over 2 blocks without question. Callahan moved with lightning speed, placing the charges at key fracture points under the rock overhang. She wasn't an explosives expert. She was an artist. She wasn't trying to create a massive blast, but a precisely directed shockwave. She rigged a simple time detonator using the guts of her digital watch. "We have 90 seconds from the time I set this," she said, her voice deadly calm. "We move the wounded down that trail 50 meters. When the charge goes, it will trigger a landslide, burying this path and cutting us off from the main enemy force. It will buy us the time we need for the Chinook to find a place to land." It was an insane plan. The timing had to be perfect. A second too early, and the enemy would see it and fall back. A second too late, and they could be caught in the blast themselves. General Thorne, lying on his litter, looked up at her. His face was a wreck of pain, humiliation, and a dawning, terrible respect. He had sent this woman into the meat grinder, had publicly shamed her, had dismissed her as a political stunt. And now, she was the only reason any of them were still alive. He looked at the wide, terrified eyes of Captain Miller and the exhausted faces of his rangers. They were all looking at Callahan, waiting for her command. His authority was gone, given up not in a formal transfer, but bled out into the mud of the jungle. He had to make it official. "Captain Miller," Thorne rasped, his voice cracking. The captain's head snapped toward him. "You heard the lieutenant commander." Thorne's eyes locked with Callahan's. "Do what she says. Follow her orders." That's a direct command. It was a complete abdication. A general handing command of his men to a lieutenant commander he had tried to break. Callahan gave a curt nod. "Let's move. Go. Go." She set the timer. 90 seconds. The organized chaos was immediate. The Rangers, moving with adrenaline-fueled strength, hauled the litters and began scrambling down the narrow trail. Callahan was the last one, her rifle at the ready, covering their retreat. The sounds of the approaching enemy grew louder, shouted commands in a foreign tongue, the clatter of weapons. 70 seconds, Reyes yelled. They were moving as fast as they could, slipping and sliding in the mud. The trail was narrow, the jungle close and suffocating. 50 seconds. Callahan glanced back. She could see the first of the enemy fighters breaking through the trees, moving toward their now abandoned position. 30 seconds. They rounded a bend in the trail, putting a small spur of rock between them and the impending landslide. 10. Reyes counted down. 9, 8, 7. They flattened themselves against the jungle floor, covering their heads. 3, 2, 1. The explosion was not a loud boom, but a deep, powerful thump, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. It was followed by a sickening grinding sound, the groan of 1,000,000 tons of rock and earth giving way. A tremendous roar filled the air as the entire overhang collapsed, sending an avalanche of shale, mud, and trees crashing down onto the path below. The ground shook violently. The landslide continued for a full 30 seconds, a river of rock that utterly obliterated the trail and the hillside, sealing the pass completely. When the last rock had settled, a thick cloud of dust hung in the air. Silence descended, broken only by the sound of the approaching Chinook. They were cut off. They were safe. Callahan was already on her feet, scanning the sky. "The chopper is looking for an LZ. That clearing, 400 meters east. Let's go." The final trek was a blur of exhaustion. They burst into a small, natural clearing just as the massive CH-47 descended, its rotor wash tearing at the trees. The ramp dropped, and 2 pararescuemen, the legendary PJs, ran out to help with the wounded. They loaded Thorne first, then the other 2 injured Rangers. The rest of the platoon scrambled aboard, collapsing onto the floor of the helicopter, their ordeal finally over. Callahan was the last one to board. As she stepped onto the ramp, she looked back at the jungle one last time. It had tried to swallow them, but she had forced it to spit them back out. The flight back to Nightingale was loud and jarring. No one spoke. The The PJs worked on the wounded while the Rangers sat in stunned, exhausted silence, their eyes vacant. Captain Miller sat hunched over, his head in his hands. Master Sergeant Reyes simply watched Callahan, who was methodically checking her rifle, ensuring the action was clear of the mud and grit from the landslide. When they landed back at the FOB, the place was in a state of controlled panic. Medics rushed the ramp with stretchers. A grim-faced colonel from the command staff was there to meet them, his face a mixture of relief and dread. As the medics were carefully lifting General Thorne's stretcher off the chopper, he called out, "Callahan!" She stopped and turned to him. Thorne struggled to prop himself up on his elbows. His face was gray with pain, but his eyes were clear. He looked at the colonel, then at the assembled staff, then back at her, ensuring he had an audience. He reached into the pocket of his torn, muddy uniform. His fingers fumbled, but he pulled out the gold trident he had taken from her. It was caked in mud. He held it out. His voice was hoarse, but it carried across the tarmac. "This belongs to you, Commander." Callahan walked over to the stretcher. She looked down at the pin, then at the general. There was no triumph in her expression. No, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, weary calm. She took the trident from his hand. Without a word, she wiped the mud from it on her sleeve, the gold glinting in the harsh floodlights. Then, with the same precise, deliberate movements as before, she pinned it back onto her uniform, right over her heart. It settled into place, its familiar weight a quiet affirmation. She looked at Thorne one last time, gave him a slow, formal nod of acknowledgement, and walked away, leaving him and his shattered career behind on the tarmac. Days later, a pall of quiet introspection hung over FOB Nightingale. General Thorne had been medevaced back to Germany, his command officially and permanently relinquished. An investigation was underway, but everyone knew the outcome. His career was over, ended not by an enemy bullet, but by his own arrogance and the quiet competence of the woman he had tried to break. Callahan remained. She did not participate in the debriefings beyond submitting her written after-action report, a document that was clinical, precise, and devoid of any mention of the personal conflict. It focused only on tactics, enemy disposition, and recommendations for future operations in mountainous, monsoon-affected environments. It was, in its own way, more damning than any accusation. The whispers that followed her through the compound had changed. The dismissive sneers were gone, replaced by gazes of awe and a wide, respectful berth. The men from the platoon spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones, the story of the climb, the jury-rigged radio, and the landslide already becoming the stuff of legend. The name Nix was never spoken aloud, but it was there, an unspoken truth in the back of everyone's mind. Late one night, long after the last call to prayer from a distant village had faded, Callahan was in the armory. The long, metal-walled room smelled of solvent and steel. She had her 17 Malawian kwachas completely disassembled on a cleaning mat, each piece laid out in perfect order. She worked under the stark fluorescent lights, her hands moving with a fluid, practiced grace. The rhythmic scrape of the carbon rod, the soft whisk of the brush, the final, satisfying click of reassembly. It was a ritual, a form of meditation that centered her. The door creaked open. Master Sergeant Reyes entered. He didn't speak. He carried his own saw and a cleaning kit. He looked at Callahan, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and set up his gear at a bench down the row from her. Soon, the rhythmic sounds of his own work joined hers. A few minutes later, the door opened again. It was Captain Miller. His face was still drawn, the arrogance stripped from him, replaced by a haunted, humbled look. He saw Callahan, then Reyes. He hesitated for a moment, then walked to the arms cage, drew his M4, and took a spot at an empty bench. He began to strip the weapon, his movements clumsy at first, then settling into the familiar cadence. One by one, others from the platoon drifted in. Sergeant Diaz, the young PFC whose shoulder Callahan had patched up. Each man entered in silence, drew his weapon, and found a space. Soon, The armory was filled with a dozen men, all working in the quiet of the late night. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The only sounds were the metallic poetry of soldiers tending to their tools, the slide of a bolt, the click of a trigger assembly, the soft buffing of an oiled rag. It was a silent, solemn vigil, an unspoken covenant of respect. They weren't just cleaning their rifles. They were paying homage, acknowledging the quiet, unshakable center around which their shattered world had reformed. They were standing watch with the ghost who had walked out of the storm and led them back to the living. And in the shared rhythmic silence, a new kind of trust was being forged, one that had been earned in blood, in sweat, and in the deep, unforgiving mud of the Devil's Nest.